you touched on something earlier with AI generated content. Something that I'm seeing for us, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead into the conversation probably, but a big piece of what we're focusing on going forward is what I believe is going to be greater and greater demand is in person or live, unedited content. And so as AI generated content becomes more and more prevalent, trust is eroding from that of is this real? Is this, what is this? And so I'm saying this from being building a video production company of like high end quality video. That's not what people want anymore. And there's a reason that I moved out of that, which is if you are telling customer testimonials or nonprofit donor testimonials, it doesn't have to be polished and you don't have to make it all this perfect piece. It's capture it and share it. That's what matters. And be authentic and raw rather than polished. And that's what people will trust more nowadays going forward, in my belief, because they will know that it's not AI generated when it's not polished.
You are listening to Power Marketing with Kevin Lee. Kevin and his agency Did It have helped thousands of businesses win through superior marketing, as have his books, articles, speaking engagements, and the E-Marketing Association Power Marketing podcasts. Here's Kevin.
Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. I also run an agency, Did It, as well as Truth Nutrition and a bunch of other ventures, including an incubator called Various Ventures. So under the EMA hat, today I'm super excited to be chatting with Rob Burke, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at DonorDock, which is in the nonprofit ecosystem as a CRM, plus a little bit more. And since I run a nonprofit, I'm super excited to be chatting with Rob. But let's jump in first, Rob, because you're not, that's not the only hat you wear. You're also still running a 3D production company, and you ran a production company prior to that that was, I believe, primarily video focused. So
Yeah.
what's the common theme there? And, all these marketing hats that you currently wear and have had to wear, what's sort of the common best practices that you think overlap all forms of marketing?
Mm, that's a big question, but I'd say the piece that I love about marketing and, you know, it can touch so many different aspects or different businesses easily, which is the storytelling piece. It's if you can connect the problem to what it is that you offer, if it's a service, a software, whatever it is, if you can connect that problem and clearly define it and clearly communicate it through storytelling, that's the common denominator across the board, right? And storytelling has become this buzzword in marketing, and so I hesitate to even use it, but you know 20 years I've been doing this in the marketing world, and that's what it comes down to is this binary idea of uh, loss to hope, clarity or chaos to clarity. It's these binary pieces that tell a story and that invite the user into what it is that they get out of it versus just another tool that they could use. And so I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this, but yeah, I mean, with the background that I've got of building an agency and selling that was solely just video production for for-profit companies. We worked with nonprofits as well, but now shifting over as a CMO into DonorDock, which is a software that's a for-profit company built for the nonprofit sector. It's a really fun intersection of getting to still market, but having clear impact and a very clear mission of, hey, we're not just selling a tool because we think we can make money on it. We're selling a tool that will hopefully impact and create a ripple effect and be a small piece of making our communities better across the nation. And so that's where I see the correlation between all the different pieces that I've done.
Cool, cool. I would absolutely agree. Storytelling is a wonderful vehicle for marketing. I think perhaps it's even more important now than ever before because,
Yeah.
under my agency, one of the hats my team wears a lot is the SEO hat, which has now evolved into generative engine optimization or answer engine optimization, as Shelley Palmer likes to call it, which requires that there be a whole lot of information out there for LLMs to digest, right?
Yep.
And the more information that's out there that talks about who you are and the problems that you solve and the context around those problems, the more likely an LLM type answer bot is to recommend your brand or your business to the person who's doing the search. It's a very different kind of a user experience than the 10 or 20 blue links that we're used to in a Google or Bing. So for folks who are sort of future proofing and thinking like, what's the common denominator across my marketing stack that is I need to be working on? Storytelling really is one of those, right? Because it's active in social media, creating social media content you can share. It's active in providing assets to the sales team that they can go ahead and use and share. It's active for the marketing team because they're the ones sort of potentially forging the storytelling. And so, and of course, there's the SEO and AEO element of it. So I would agree, storytelling is key, but I guess I'll flip it back to you. Sometimes on the did it side of things, we've got a client that's not in a particular exciting industry. So when you had clients that were perhaps in a not so exciting industry, and they had to story tell in video form back when you had the agency and did a lot of video production. Now, how would you ideate around telling a story? I mean, we're lucky in the nonprofit world that the stories are sort of a byproduct of the fact
Sure.
that there's a social impact element to what we do, right? But sometimes, you're an accounting firm or a law firm, or you have a technology that sorts garbage into aluminum cans versus trash. Like it's not always so exciting. So how do you tease out those stories for people who are listening or watching this and are like, yeah, but my business is boring?
Yeah. That's a great question. I'll tell you a story. So back in the agency world, I walked into a conference room and sat down, and the client explained to me what it is that they do and that they need to sell software to pig farmers. And if you think about software and pig farmers, they are not technically tech savvy usually, and they don't care about the software. They're raising pigs and they're creating feed and they're farmers, right? And so they were like, "Hey, we need to show all the software and everything." And I brought them back to storytelling. I said, "What is it that the farmers care about? It's not about the software; it's about the outcome." And so like when I think of storytelling, it's these pieces of the storytelling that we could break down of the different segments. It's how are you the guide and how do you make them the hero? And yeah, you're right. Social causes tend to be more interesting and tend to be easier to say like, hey, donors are the guide and let's make the whoever's getting impacted the heroes and the guide gets to help them and whatever you want to tell the story that way. But there are also charities that are boring or they can't tell the stories because of legal reasons. And so they can struggle with this as well. And so it always comes back to what is it that the person you're marketing to cares about. And so if it's the donor that you're trying to attract prospects and for them to donate or volunteer, and tell the story from their perspective. And so that's what we did with the pig farmers is rather than tell this story of software, we actually told a narrative around the hard work and getting up early at 4 a.m. and the dirt and the grime. And we went and shot all of this in pig farms. And I threw away most of the camera gear after that event. But but we told the narrative around the hard work and resonating with the farmers of what they care about. And they look at themselves as these hard workers that have families that they are raising, and they don't care about this big technology piece usually, and they're just trying to build a farm and grow their economy from that standpoint. And so that's the story we told. We barely talked about the software. We just showed it in action through the story and perspective of a farmer. And so you can carry that across any field. Like an accountant can talk about that from the perspective of the person that they're helping get out of a bad tax situation or what have you. So there's always a story to tell, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's a great a great example. When I've had clients ask me that in the did it context, I've often said, why don't you ideate with some of your customers, right? So while you're at it, you can get some testimonials, which are essentially a story as well. And you
Yeah.
may find a common theme in your testimonials. So, put those video testimonials or written testimonials in the can to use for marketing. But at the same time, if you notice a reoccurring theme, there's your stories, right? And
Yeah.
so you end up using your clients or your customers as a way to get stories.
Yeah, and you touched on something earlier with AI generated content. Something that I'm seeing for us, and I'm jumping a little bit ahead into the conversation probably, but a big piece of what we're focusing on going forward is what I believe is going to be greater and greater demand is in-person or live, unedited content. And so as AI generated content becomes more and more prevalent, trust is eroding from that of is this real? Is this, what is this? And so I'm saying this from being building a video production company of like high end quality video. That's not what people want anymore. And there's a reason that I moved out of that, which is if you are telling customer testimonials or nonprofit donor testimonials, it doesn't have to be polished and you don't have to make it all this perfect piece. It's capture it and share it. That's what matters. And be authentic and raw rather than polished. And that's what people will trust more nowadays going forward, in my belief, because they will know that it's not AI generated when it's not polished. So this unpolished piece is becoming more and more of this layer that is almost needed, which is an interesting piece.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that the through line for that is authenticity, right? Because
Hmm.
authentic content tends to be user generated in some form. Not that we couldn't create deep fakes of our clients or customers, but uh, authentic content I think is probably also preferred by the search engines and by the LLMs, right? Because
Yeah.
AI generated content is a regurgitation of content, whereas when you're doing a video interview of a client or a prospect, or this is a byproduct of a conference that you're speaking at, et cetera. That's going to be often new content, and it's going to be sort of vetted as original or at least human in nature. So that's a
Yeah.
great point as it relates to GEO. Let's switch gears a little bit, into the target audience that you have, right? So my understanding is you're primarily focusing the DonorDock product against small to mid-size nonprofits, and the sort of the giant nonprofits are perhaps not in your target market, although I'm sure you'd be welcoming them in if they knocked on the door. So I'd love to hear about how the smaller nonprofits either see CRM differently or use CRM differently, or perhaps they have different needs from their CRM that you and the product team have chosen to focus on.
Yeah, the difference between large nonprofits and small nonprofits is massive in the sense of needs, and there's a big disconnect in the space. It's a fairly saturated market from a CRM and fundraising platform standpoint. There's so many options out there, but what we focus in on is clarity, and so over complexity, meaning so many of these pieces are built for the larger nonprofits with the expectation or the the idea that they're going to custom build and they're going to have teams that manage and update the data and segment all these donors into different lists and do all these things manually with complexity. And that's not the reality with small nonprofits. It's a one person team that's wearing 20 hats and they barely have enough time to even log in half the time. Usually they're working outside of their email. They're not even going into their CRM. And so how do we that's what we focus on. How do we bring clarity and simplicity rather than complexity to that? Of saying like how a big piece of what we do is what's called auto, and it's a piece that lives on top of our CRM. And the whole point is how do we serve up this information so that they can take action and focus on what matters most through the software? Because so many CRMs nowadays are basically becoming historical lakes of data that you might look back on and pull a report once a year from, but we want to bring it back into the actual customer or constituent relationship management of ongoing actionable data that you're going to use with current donors, not past donors, because that's not very useful. And so that's a big piece of what how we focus is, all right, how do we simplify and how do we bring in things like AI that are easy to use, that bring clarity rather than adding complexity and more things for them to juggle or more tools. And so, yeah, you're right on. We're the small to medium sized nonprofit are very underserved in that sense. They are sold to quite a bit, but they're very underserved.
I'd love to hear some stories about how perhaps there are differences within the nonprofits of the same size, but in different sectors. Because in the United States, if you're talking purely 501(c)(3)s, there's obviously, probably a million houses of worship, which are all 501(c)(3s, and then you've got like, nonprofits in the healthcare world, and so some of them are national and virtual, and others are in person and hyper local. So I'd love to hear sort of how that changes how a nonprofit perhaps uses a CRM based
Mm.
on what sector they're in.
Yeah, I would say faith-based is definitely the a little bit of the outlier. If maybe that's the right way. They've got some really specific feature sets that they need, especially when you're thinking of like house of worship, of worship band, management, or kids church management, like all these pieces that could be
Yeah,
their own software tools in
yeah.
themselves. And so we look at that as a little bit of an outlier. We definitely have some churches or faith-based organizations on our system, but the rest of them, there's definitely different ways that they use the CRM, but when it comes down to it, it's relationship management still. And so if they can segment down to a couple different things, especially from a fundraising standpoint of recurring donors and first-time donors, and uh, be served up actionable nudges for them to use of, hey, Rob gave last year but hasn't given yet this year. You should give him a call and check in and continue that relationship, right? So those are the pieces that no matter what sector or what segment you're in inside of the sector, if you're a human services or arts and culture, uh, all of it boils down to relationship. And so we look at it a little bit. We're not trying to change the product depending on who it is. We're looking at it as uh, you all need to be doing these core best practices from a fundraising standpoint and relationship building standpoint. And so that's what DonorDock is built for.
So I'd love to get some best practices around this, use of push messaging, and that would include email and SMS and potentially some other push notification options, and how the nonprofit should think through the storytelling, which has no call to action to donation and is really just here's what we're doing that relates to our mission, and here's what we're accomplishing, and maybe some stories from the field versus stories from the field and or more call to action centric messaging where they are actually looking for a donation.
Mm,
Because some of the stuff I receive is like just out there like support us, and they almost
yeah.
forget to say what they do, right? They assume right? Whereas other communications I get from nonprofits are much more sort of stories from the field and or testimonials from the field.
I would argue that they should not be separate, meaning your storytelling should be this continuous narrative, no matter if they've given or if they volunteered or if they are about to give. You should still be telling the same story, and maybe the some of the sentences change, so that's where segmentation can come in. But if you are inviting them into being a part of actually making an impact, that's part of the story. It's not to your point, like if you're just asking for money and you're not saying like this is where your money is going and this is how it's impacting, then you're missing the mark, right? You're not inviting them along for the journey because as donors, we're all donors probably to a nonprofit. As a donor, I want to feel like I'm not boots on the ground helping our food pantry here locally, but if I'm donating to them, I want to feel like I'm boots on the ground through my donation. And so if they can return that as saying like, hey, here's where your money went last month and here's how many meals that was served. That's the piece of storytelling that continues the relationship. And, a big statistic in the nonprofit sector is always about retention, and that retention is really really low nowadays where people are donating once or they're canceling their recurring donations and they're moving on. I believe a big piece of that is because um, nonprofits, especially small nonprofits, don't have the time or they're not focusing on the relationship building aspect of saying what matters is not just the impact, but it's also sharing the impact to our constituents. And so that's where the relationship piece of it comes into play.
For sure. That's some great advice there. So one of the things that probably differs a lot between the bigger nonprofits, medium size, and then down into smaller is bigger nonprofits can slice and dice and segment lots of different ways, right? Whereas the size of the CRM file for a smaller nonprofit may suggest a more simplistic segmentation, right? Like active donors versus lapsed donors? Are there some other sort of simple, easy to use segments that the smaller nonprofit can use so that they're providing the right messaging to the right people at the right time?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. A lot of people talk about segmentation and all these different ways that you can slice the pie. But when it comes down to it, most organizations are barely slicing the pie. They might have a newsletter sign up segmentation and a donor segmentation, and then the rest of it is just people in the CRM. And so, some really basic segmentations that you can start to like, if you look at the narrative as this timeline and you start to segment of saying, like, hey, this is a piece of the narrative of they've donated and or they're a recurring donor, and so we need to make sure that we're telling the narrative of how their donations are impacting continuously, not just once but every 6 months. We send out an impact update, or if they're a major donor, we call them every month or every quarter and thank them and and tell them how they're impacting, right? So when you think of segmentation, it is, you can keep it simple, but so many aren't even doing these things. But it's recurring donors, it's first time donors, it's prospects that haven't given, it's volunteers, it's major donors. And one that we talk about a fair amount that we're not hearing enough of is that mid-sized donor, meaning they're not giving $20 a month, but they're also not giving 20,000 a year. They're giving maybe 500 a month. And that mid-size is different than the person that's just throwing $5 at an organization. They want more involvement, but it can still be a little bit automated without having to be the major donor, call them every month, because that's a little bit unscalable.
Sure, great points. Let's shift gears to when you're wearing the marketing hat for yourself as chief marketing officer, and you're out there trying to make sure that your budget goes as far as possible. You've obviously got to manage your own media mix, and that includes things like in-person events. It includes paid media. It includes earned media. And you've got to make decisions. Bottom of the funnel versus top of the funnel. Branding and awareness versus direct response. So, how do you think about your budget? How do you think about where to place your punches?
Mm. Yeah, I mean, the ongoing battle is always, do we focus on long-term top of funnel pieces of driving distribution to getting in front of more people, or do we focus on bottom of funnel of just converting those that are already in our funnel and we're trying to make the sales this month, right? So it's always that battle between the two. For me, I said this a little bit earlier. We're really focusing and doubling down on that in-person and live content piece. And so we're showing up at events more often than we have ever in the past, because we want to have the real relationship piece. An example of this is a year and a half ago, we tried to go the PLG route, product-led growth, meaning click and buy. We saw, like, especially for the small nonprofits, in order to keep our price down, let's not do sales and let's just let them get into the product and tour it themselves and then buy. But what we found is, especially these small nonprofits, they want to build trust, and they want to trust where their data is going to live for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And so we actually kind of reversed that and said, actually, they want to talk to us more often. And so that was a big learning thing for us last year, which is we need to show up in person or one-on-one or webinars and have not consumption-based marketing, but back and forth marketing, where they get to talk to us and we get to talk to them, because they want relationship and they want to build trust. And so that's where we're focusing in on from our marketing standpoint, which is events, webinars where we're having discussions, community building. All of those pieces are more important than ads or articles, if you will. SEO is still important, but it's not as important as community nowadays, I think.
That's a great point. And I would imagine in a software company and CRM company in particular, that you and the marketing team are going to be really joined at the hip with the sales team, right? Because the sales team, since you've decided that PLG is not the way to go, right? You're going to have salespeople, people in various stages of conversation, essentially, with different stages of close potential within your CRM, right? And
Yeah.
so, what have you heard back from the sales teams and, in your feedback loop with them as to what's working and what's not working, or messaging or stories that are working? to allow you to modify your go-to-market plan.
Yeah, I mean, PLG was a big one where we weren't just seeing a drop off from those that are signing up manually, but our sales team, where it was definitely front lines, and our customer support, our CS is a big frontline piece as well, which is listening to them and adjusting marketing based on what matters today, because marketing needs to be a moving target. Otherwise, you're going to fall behind, right? And so, you know, we talk to we're a small team, so we're not this, we're not 1,000 people where marketing is disconnected from sales. We're pretty interconnected, and we're talking constantly every week, and we're shifting our messaging. An example, which is the messaging around clarity. These small nonprofits don't want these complex systems. They want something they can get in and out of, and even certain areas of the feature growth that we've shifted some of our product development around is realizing that half of them aren't even logging into a CRM. They're wanting to work outside of their email. So how do we let them manage and update their CRM from their email? And so it's not just marketing, but we're trying to listen to our CS and sales teams across the board.
One thing that's common, I think, for-profit marketers and nonprofit marketers is really breaking through the clutter, right? And I find that, even when giving forward is essentially marketing to nonprofits and trying to give them things for free, it's hard to break through the clutter, right? Because everybody's so busy, with whatever their day-to-day job is at that nonprofit, that they have to really manage their own bandwidth, right? So breaking through the clutter is a common theme. So what would
Yeah.
you recommend to marketers of all types who are trying to figure out how to break through the clutter and, engage in those conversations, when they're confident that whatever they have to offer is actually of huge value to that prospect, right? And it's and to that company, and it's really just getting the attention of the either the individual decision maker, or in the case of B2B, or sometimes B to charity, right? There's a committee, right? And you need to get the attention of more than one person. So
Hmm.
what is your recommendation to marketers as far as breaking through the clutter?
I'd say the number one piece is don't focus so much on the solution, focus on the conflict. Because going back to storytelling, great story is at the intersection of conflict and resolution. And so if you're not talking about the conflict, then you are noise. Then you're just another solution, versus if you're focusing in on this is the conflict, especially if you can identify the conflict and the problem and say it in the same voice as your potential customer or your potential donor. If you can talk about conflict and talk about and posit the question of how do I resolve this, rather than just saying here's the solution. Invite them into the story of figuring out how to solve it, and be the guide for that in the story. And so that's a big piece. Is so many pieces of marketing that feel like noise is because they're just marketing the solution and they're not talking about the conflict enough.
So how would you differentiate between what a normal sort of sales team would call pain points and
Sure,
conflict? Because they sound like they're a little bit analogous to each other, but
they are.
conflict sounds like it's a little bit different from a voice perspective.
Mm. I would say conflict is always from the voice of the customer versus the voice of the product. And so pain points and conflict, you could say it's two sides of the same coin. So it is, if you can talk to the pain points from the perspective of the customer, not just saying like, hey, this pain point, here's the solution for you. It's all right, let's talk about your pain point. How do you feel about that? What are you doing when it happens? Where are you at when it happens? How often does it happen? And like sit in the discomfort with them. That's the difference between, I think, conflict and pain points, where it's just saying like, hey, here's a pain point, here's a solution. So much of that can be, it's the same side, or it's the two sides of the same coin. But I think when we talk about pain points, in my opinion, a lot of times it becomes just the starting point to talk about the solution rather than the topic itself.
Yeah, it's great advice on how to just frame it a little bit differently. So, a final question, sort of what has you excited about the next year marketing your product and solution to folks, or in general, what excites you about marketing for the next 12 months?
Yeah, I'd say two things. We are quickly developing what we're calling focused fundraising. So these are tools that help like fundraisers and small nonprofits grow, learn, and have greater impact. And so a big piece of what we're doing is focusing in on how do we not help fundraisers do more, but help them focus on what matters most. And so that's a big piece of what we're focusing in on is the focused piece and the clarity piece. So I'm excited about just the messaging that we're pushing because it feels really relevant. Everybody feels like they need to do more, that there's all these shoulds that they should be doing. And our message is all about you don't need to do more. You need to focus on what matters most and get those things done. And what tools are you using to do that? The second one is building community. So, like I mentioned earlier, we're really doubling down on live events and webinars that are two-way communication rather than just consumption based. And so I'm really excited to show up more often in inside cities that we've got customers or prospects and show up online and in person more often.
Great. Excellent advice for probably a lot of the folks out there. Thanks, Rob, so much for joining me and sharing your wisdom.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin.
Kevin Lee's Power Marketing is available on all your favorite podcast networks. Kevin loves helping businesses excel at marketing. Having marketing challenges? Just like Santa in The Miracle on 34th Street, if Kevin can't help you, he'll know someone who can. Find him on LinkedIn, subscribe, or follow.